Welcome to the Star Love Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Beck, the Oracle in New Orleans, founder of Inner Makeup Astrology. To learn more about what I do, visit innermakeup.net. And today I am extraordinarily grateful to have Geoffrey Cornelius. Geoffrey Cornelius is one of my favorite astrologers in the world, and he came out with a book called Moment of Astrology, Origins and Divination in the early 90s. And to get an idea about how, in my opinion and many others' opinions, how important this book is, this is what Patrick Curry said. This is an extraordinary book. I believe that within the astrological tradition, it is the most important since the great flowering of European astrology more than 300 years ago. Quietly but deeply subversive, this is a book for lovers of wisdom. And also one of our other eminent astrologers, Rob Hand, calls it one of the most important astrological books of our time. It not only reshapes the view of astrology that astrologers might have, it challenges the entire notion of what constitutes knowing and knowledge in our civilization. It shows that astrology is not only important in and of itself, but also for what it reveals about the nature of truth and our experience of it in general. And personally, Moment of Astrology saved my astrological life because when I was first starting out, I felt that there had to be some kind of objective astrology that I needed to bring to every session. So what was happening was I felt like I was jumping off a cliff with every reading. And, I would do all this preparation. I would even write an essay for each client to just show, no, I've done this work. And, you can see that I've done this and I'm, hopefully this works. And miraculously, the readings work that I do. And, the astrologer Anthony Lewis, he recommended the Moment of Astrology to me at one point. He said, you'll love it. And it was true, and it really had such a profound impact on me as far as the own astrological work that I do, because I do think astrology is best placed in the realm of divination and the humanities. So with that, Geoffrey, how goes it?
Yes, Dan, thank you very much for that introduction, and it's an honour to be on your podcast, Dan, so thank you. I hope we can uncover some interesting things for your listeners. How goes it with me? Well, it's always an open book what's going to happen when one starts to talk on these themes, because they are actually quite fast. Those tremendous quotes you gave me from Rob Hand. What's interesting about Rob is that he doesn't necessarily agree with a whole number of things I say, but Rob Hand knows that this is an area of debate that we've got to have as intelligent modern astrologers. So that's really where I'm coming from, and I don't expect all listeners or readers to agree with me on all points, but I'd like them to think about the implications of either agreeing or disagreeing. So I originally put the question to many astrologers, okay, is astrology, horoscopic astrology, let's limit the field at the moment to what we ordinarily do with horoscopes, is that best to be seen as some type of technical science, or is it best seen in the light of divination? Hence the way I've pitched the Moment of Astrology. And one thing to say to you and others who might not have come across my work is I'm very concerned that there should be a good craft of astrology. It is a craft, and it has to be worked. Ficino says due diligence is the basis of it. You do work at your astrology, and so you've said how you prepared yourself and used to prepare yourself for readings. You do that. This is very like the Virgo we're talking about in our moment of talking. You do that work, but that itself doesn't guarantee the grace that occurs, the extraordinary movement that occurs with symbol, as symbol begins to arise in our consciousness. And it's that interests me, and it's that has to be privileged in our astrology. But it doesn't mean we ever get rid of good techniques and good craft and practical astrology. So I'm all for that. I like good craft.
Yes, and just for, you said, I'm a Virgo, and the only reason I bring this up for people who want to know, who can want to look at the chart of this moment this is a moment of astrology. It's July 23rd, 2020. It's a little bit after 9 a.m. Central Time, because I'm down in New Orleans, which is the southern part of the United States in Central Time Zone. And Geoffrey, you're calling from England. So that's, this moment of astrology, and, people can look into that, how they might want to. But it's one thing to hold on to is that this idea of astrology is kind of this kernel within us, that it's not so much this objective interpretation of observable reality, but that divination actually comes from within. And I always go back to this quote by Marsilio Ficino, that the heavens are entirely within. And we're going to get at that a little bit. That's a big point, I think, in all of this. But could you just talk a little bit about your background, some of the teaching you do, what you've been up to?
Okay, I will. I've been many, many decades in astrology, so I've been with it for so many years. But actually, I came into astrology through an interest in and a real attempt to research into divination. So as a youngster, I did tarot and similar things, and I tried to experiment with all sorts of things. And a very important move for me was to begin to get into the I Ching, the Book of Changes. And in many ways, you see, when I finally came into craft astrology as a craft of divination, I'm already looking at it within the viewpoint of somebody who's used to divination and the phenomena, remarkable phenomena, and human phenomena as well, of divination. So that's how I place my astrology. And that it's only gradually, as I met with astrologers and entered into the discourse of astrology, I began to realize that isn't the most common way in, that it's people who haven't come in through a previous practice of the imagination or of divination will have a different view. And so I realize there are many different ways one comes into astrology. In terms of my own biography, then, I've been many years involved in education in various ways, mostly at what's called in this country adult education, which is like part-time enthusiast hobby. So I was one of the first people in inner London to be able to be permitted to teach astrology in a education evening class. So I love that type of work. And then in more recent times, I've got involved at the university level, and have recently been involved with a master's programme, Myth, Cosmology and the Sacred, at Canterbury Christ Church University. That is now closing down with both COVID and the university changing everything. So we've come to an end of a 7-year phase of that work. But that too is all part of my work, really. And that's dealing a lot with not trying to teach people astrology as such, but entering into the fields of the imaginal and the poetic and the mythopoeic, which interests me greatly. I hope that gives a little bit of a line through. And then I've been a teacher of astrology quite a lot, done quite a lot of practical teaching of astrology, which I enjoy, and I also am a consultant as well. So I do that work and love that work. So I'm in that sense a craft astrologer, but I have many other things I want to teach on the basis of that.
Go ahead. So you said this is an era that's somewhat closing for you. I mean, dear, this world right now, I mean, it's been the most disrupted it's probably ever been in our lifetimes. But what might you imagine for yourself going forward as far as your own work?
Well, it's quite clear that I've got to embrace much more social media and make materials that go online more. And both me and my colleagues at the Company of Astrologers, small group of teachers, my partner Maggie Hyde, are thinking of developing much more our work online, and that's obviously how we're going to go. That's a shame, because I love small classes of people and meeting with people. That I love doing astrology that way, but we're all going to change. And I do think that the coming Jupiter-Saturn, the change, the mutation into air, does mark out a new phase. And I do have hopes. And I believe the astrology backs it up, that we will resolve COVID a little better than our worst fears might be. That we'll be into a new phase by middle of next year.
Yes, and just a couple small technical points. Your website is astrodivination.com, and people can also go to the Company of Astrologers website, which actually, it was Maggie who just released an essay about the coming Saturn-Jupiter conjunction, correct?
Yes, there's a free download of a whole Zoom session on that, actually. They're very welcome to look at it. It bears particularly on the UK situation, but the treatment of the equinox and solstice maps is very, very relevant for anywhere in the world. So, and I think we take we've been relatively optimistic on the basis of that astrology, I must say. However, Dan, just to say to you, the appearance of Neowise recently has quite stirred up the pot, I would say. I'm still, and so is Maggie, and so all of us, trying to just get a handle on what the comet is trying to show us. That's another whole. That would take us into another whole podcast.
Yes, I'm trying to see the comet, but we've had a lot of cloudy nights. It's like the comet seems to be obscuring.
So we've managed to see it 4 nights running. It's
nice.
Something. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So, check all that stuff out. Go to astrodivination.com, go to the Company of Astrologers website, and you can donate and support this work. I gave a donation the other day because I saw this essay pop up that Maggie did, and please support this work. It's wonderful stuff.
Thanks, Dan. That's a big
help.
Yes.
Yes. I had a thought, but let me just go on. It's just as a little aside. It's interesting you bring up I Ching, because I Ching keeps announcing itself to me over my whole life, because the famous experimental composer John Cage used I Ching, and I have my background in classical music and the humanities. So when you talk about an entry point into astrology, I found my entry into astrology through the arts, but then also divination, I guess, similarly to you. And I just, so it's interesting you announce I Ching today. And there also Philip K. Dick, a famous writer people may know from Man in the High Castle, and it's like I Ching everywhere. And I actually, my sister does feng shui, and I've done some work on my living space, and I swear it works. Who knows? There's good skeptical arguments against it, but there's something I Ching keeps calling to me. But then you've warned me, Dan, you have to focus, and it needs to be simple, and don't go. All right, so wonderful. So let's talk
it's a whole lifetime there, Dan.
Yes, exactly. And anyways, so the Moment of Astrology. So people, and really if you're a student of astrology, that's to whom this book is dedicated, so check it out. But interestingly, I've had other people interested in this book, and there's a lot in it that even if you're not an astrologer, there are bits and pieces that would be relevant. And when we were conceiving of doing this podcast, we're going to try to address skeptics, people who are interested in astrology, and they maybe have another discipline in their life, like maybe they're a mathematician and they might be interested in astrology. And then, of course, also other astrologers, but then also people who are doing the work of astrology in their lives. And there's an interesting thing in Moment of Astrology. It's actually one of my favorite elements. We probably don't have time to go into this that much, but one of the studies, the Vernon Clark trials that were done, you say that there was a curious result that sometimes people who they didn't have no knowledge of astrology, but they had like maybe a couple years in, they performed just as well as some of the advanced astrologers. And it was, from what I understand, a decently set up study, double blind, but it was live astrology. It was live in the moment. And I've seen this in my own life. Like, just briefly, there was a lady I met. She was an Aries. I mean, she was like hard driving at me, but successful businesswoman. And she led a team of salesmen, and she used the moon phases in her own kind of homegrown way, and it worked. And she did some, funny enough, Chinese astrology. And she said herself that Chinese and Western, she's like, it's different, but it says the same thing. I mean, she was hard Aries, and I love this lady. So that gets into what is astrology? Is it a language? I've been coming to if we're going to classify it a divinatory art, a client gifted me with that term, or an interpretive analysis. I think these are some ways to begin to think about astrology. But regardless of all that, so the message of that is, it's like the chef Thomas Keller. He, if anybody knows him here in the States, French Laundry per se, famous restaurants, he says, if you have great ingredients and good tools, you can cook just as well as me. So for those of you listening out there, kind of maybe you were in a position like I was, like 4 years ago or so, where you're like, I'm doing astrology, but wow, there are so many techniques and it's so advanced. Remember, it's a journey. You can have great insights along the way, and that will teach you. Okay. So, Moment of Astrology. Oh, sorry, do you want to say something? Go ahead.
No, I was going to say there that it's so interesting you seized on that theme. And there's a quote from Ficino that backs that up, actually, about often those who are unlearned in the art will make a surprising interpretation. It's that it's an interesting double bind, Dan, because once you get fascinated by astrology and you see something of its power very, very early on in your contact with it, and you're amazed by it, which I was, and I think many people getting into it are, you then begin to learn more and more about it, and you can't then stop learning and progressing and looking at other techniques and studying it more and more. But the odd thing is that the truthful result isn't guaranteed by techniques. And so that is an error that Western mind can easily fall into, thinking that it requires a mastery of masses of techniques to be good. In fact, the great moves are often very, very simple, and that's why I admire someone like William Lilly. You see some of the simplicity, actually, and purity of the symbolism, and it comes back to often very, very simple observations of planets and signs and things of that nature, very close to sun sign astrology. So you get the odd dilemma that there are some people with a real gift at spotting people's sun signs and coming up with the absolute apt way of describing that, and you think, well, that's really good astrology. It's like your woman, you're talking about the saleswoman with the Aries. It doesn't need to be amazingly sophisticated, but having said that, with due diligence, as Ficino says, you will go on and you have to master the craft. That does require work. So it's odd, the two things go together. You do work at it, but you're never so foolish as to think that the work guarantees the result. The result is always some remarkable type of grace that does inhabit the soul of each of us, some grace, an inner intuition. And that's where the thinkers like Ficino are so important for us, at understanding that inner grace.
Yes, and I'm sorry, what was the last word you said?
Just the understanding of an inner grace. You're graced, it becomes an inward knowing.
Yes.
But it's a gift to you, actually, and you're honoured to have it, but it is yours to create with as well. It's a very odd thing. Have you created it? Have the gods created it? Well, we can't say it. It lies in this mysterious betweenness of things.
Yes, and here, I've prepared a bunch of different inspirational quotes from literature and poetry, and this is from Mary Oliver. She says, you can have the other words, chance, luck, coincidence, serendipity. I'll take grace. I don't know what it is exactly, but I'll take it.
Oh, that's so again, lovely. That's lovely.
Isn't it? Yeah. Yes. Isn't it though? Because we have to have the grace to accept these inspired divinatory moments. And interestingly, this gets into, and I don't know if we have time. We really don't have time to explore this, but the idea of just pure chance actually being meaningful. And one author who brought this up for me is Thomas Pynchon, who wrote Gravity's Rainbow, which is a crazy novel. It's like 7, and people should check this out. But actually, he knows some astrology, very reclusive writer. But he says the operations of a god are no different than chance. So, and then the end of the book for people, it ends with a tarot reading, Kabbalah, and Gravity's Rainbow is all about rockets firing off, and it's pre-World War II, World War II, and it's just this crazy zany book. But there's this concept of if the rocket really hits, well, what happens? And it even gets into something called Poisson distribution, which is chance. But there's a funny line that somebody asks, well, what if the rocket hits and it throws off the Earth, and then the guy says, it'll change the signs, dummy. so it's just a little bit of funny. And I do have the exact quote of the Ficino that you were talking about. Through whatever art future things may be investigated, they are foretold more completely out of a certain gift of the soul than through judgment. Here often those unlearned in the art judge more truthfully than those who are learned. The truthfulness of the judgment is not so much through scrutiny of the stars as by a certain foreknowledge innate to you. So this gets into time, and we're really introducing these ideas. These aren't our ideas, but they're we're trying to put these ideas out there for people to investigate. And then also, there are a couple characters who are going to come up in this interview that you talk about in the book, Pico and Ficino, and we're going to get into them. But then one rejoinder to what you're saying about sun sign, another book I'm going to be bringing in is Thomas Hardy's The Mayor of Casterbridge, because he really uses a lot of beautiful symbolism around the sun, moon, and stars, and the universe, and all this. So I'm going to be bringing him in today as well. A lot of writers coming in today. So, but
and that's yes.
But actually, you had wanted to, and then again, go to Astro Divination. This is Angelical Consorts, and it's from the bulletin from the Company of Astrologers, but it's online. It was June 2002, which interestingly, we're having a lunar node return to that date. So this theme is coming back up.
Yes, Dan, I should explain to people that 2002 meeting was the 400th anniversary of Lily's birth. Right. We had this celebration. So to be back on a nodal return of that celebration does connect us to Lily's own nativity in a certain way, in a certain curious way that we astrologers move.
Okay, so tell people a little bit about William Lilly, how people might interpret his work, what he did, and how you think maybe people really should be interpreting his work.
Well, the rediscovery is an odd word to use, but in the 1960s, say, or 50s, very few astrologers had seen Lilly's original Christian astrology, his very important textbook. 1647. People hadn't seen the book. They'd seen it in a reduced form, produced by Zadkiel in the 19th century, with quite pared down. There are merits to Zadkiel's work, but it doesn't give you the range of Lilly. And so the rediscovery of Lilly led to a definite impetus in the revival of horary astrology in the UK. And I was very active in that. And that paralleled the movement and seemed to be synchronistic with the movement to recover historical texts that led to our hat in the States and over in the UK. So there's this huge resurgence of interest in inverted commas traditional astrology. And the interesting thing about Lilly is the practicality of his work, as demonstrated in his textbook, it's not difficult to apply. It's very easy to get moved by it, and he has such good craft, and he's such a good teacher that it does turn people on. You wouldn't think a big dusty book from the 17th century could have that impact, but it does. Now, in the hands of good astrologers, something happens with that material, and we were very influenced by a self-taught horary astrologer called Derek Appleby, who was one of the 4 founders of the Company of Astrologers. Way back in 1983, and we were all very active in the Astrological Lodge of London, and that whole scene in London astrology was buzzing with horary and traditional astrology, and that impetus has come through powerfully. There is a stream of influence then from some doughty horarists in the States who kept the flag of horary astrology alive against the grain, really, and in particular Ivy Goldstein Jacobson, important American astrologer, but then also Mark Edmund Jones. So it's not as if this wasn't known in the States, but the horary revival had a real impact on inspiring people to investigate the tradition full stop and begin to translate the earlier texts anyway. And it all went together. And I think, you see, it's often said that there was a reaction at that time to the power of psychological astrology, which had really coming in strongly. And so you then get a counter movement of people who would be perhaps more wary of psychologizing astrology. There's a big debate there, which we could get into. And so you get this counter movement back to a more rigorous tradition, more rigorous craft form of older astrology. And so that really stirred things up in the 60s and 70s. And then the republication of Lilly's text was really, in 1985, was really a major moment. And a lot of astrology is taken off from that point. And now, in a way, Lilly's been left behind. People have gone back to an earlier tradition that he comes from.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing you realise with Christian astrology is how, for a start, its name, he's not a philosopher, his style isn't philosophical, but he is actually suggesting, and he makes it very clear in his essay to the beginner in astrology, to the student, that you are dealing with something that is an angelic discourse and that has can fully fit with Christian and religious belief full stop. You see, he would want to see that parted. So it's the last period in our history when you could get this clear equation that astrology is also spiritual and religious, as well as being practical and having true practical benefit for humankind. And of course he's famous for some of his predictions and stuff like that, which we can go into if you want, but that's another whole podcast.
Right. Well, and to put this in context, well, first of all, I live in the American South, which is very religious, and I have people who are Christians, and I don't think their pastors would like this, but they come to me. So there doesn't have to be a mutual exclusivity of astrology with religion. And I want to hold that point a little bit, because that's what lots of people have really criticized about certain forms of astrology, that it is deterministic, that it can be scientific, that we're just rendering a straight judgment. Whereas in this essay that, again, you can get on Astro Divination, this angelical consorts that was celebrating the 400th, year of Lilly, that an enchanted world versus a disenchanted world. So you talk about post-scientific enlightenment, none of us can think straight, and ironically, because we've been gifted with the age of enlightenment, because things can be replicated so much more easily, like electricity or planes, there's no kind of enchanted narrative thread, amongst it all. So it's very, we live in a very disenchanted world in that sense. We're given the gift of, in many ways, stability of, electricity or whatever, air conditioning in many parts of the world, but that doesn't give us enchantment. So that's right, what you're really touching on in this speech about enchantment versus disenchantment, and the need to perhaps revive enchantment and imagination.
Yes. I know in a way it's like a huge oversimplification, but there is a divide in human history, and especially Western history, of a pre and post scientific enlightenment, and you can say that, broadly speaking, the nature of culture prior to the scientific enlightenment is already an enchanted culture. Even in the medieval times, the Renaissance times, and earlier times, there's a sense of the place of humanity in some greater order of things, some cosmic order where there is the divine, and this interpenetrates our reality. This would be natural thinking for everyone in an earlier age. Now, in that sort of age, astrology does find a true place and home, and it has its work to do in that order. As we move into another mode of thought altogether that's given us such great gifts, and we are all children of it, and I in no way ever want to revert and deny the truth of the Enlightenment, but that gives us a terrible dilemma, because we gain the world, but in danger of losing our soul. That's what happens. We don't have a language of the soul anymore, and then it gets locked up into parts of religion that become embattled and embittered, even, and that become fundamentalist to try and protect themselves against this overwhelming tide. And so you don't even get, I think, good religion coming out of this, because it becomes defensive religion. That's so there is a problem there.
Right, and we're going to get into the arguments that have been marshaled against astrology from religion, from science, just in general, and you touch on those. I mean, there's a lot to that, but I'm trying to. We keep getting off track, which is good. I think it's good to think discursively and allow the moment of astrology to unfold here. But let's get back to just the cover of the moment of astrology. When you pick up the book, you'll see the cover. And it's, well, actually, just briefly, did you select this image for the cover, or was it somebody else's idea, or?
No, I did. I came across the image and thought it was a beautiful one, and got the permission to use it. And by, in a sense, a completely magical coincidence, the person I've worked with on all the university work, Angela Voss, who's quite an academic of Ficino, she at the same time had been communicated this picture by a colleague in America, who sent it to her at the very same time that I was getting this picture together for the book. It is very strange, and it represents a wonderful glimpse of this other world that the Renaissance magicians, humanists, whatever we call them, lived in. It is an absolutely divine picture.
Yeah, okay, so, yes. So the image itself is what we think is Father Time. It's a man holding an hourglass, and then who we think is Orpheus with a lyre sitting next to him with the sun. I don't know, is it setting or rising over the horizon?
Yes, you see, if it's rising, that it could, some would say it's stormy with a red light there, but I believe it is rising. It truly is, because it's from that moment of the sun appearing that the time can be demarcated with the hourglass. And that's why. But either way, either rising or setting, it's the sun dominates. The eye of the sun there is staring through into our reality. So it's a wonderful illustration.
Yes, and because the title of the book is The Moment of Astrology, Origins and Divination. What is that type of astrology like, potentially? I know these are big, but that feel of ritual and music, and I have some literary examples on my end, but just what simply does this mean to sort of convene with a moment in time, the here now, that it's not so much about looking into the future and making a determination about that. What is that astrology like?
We're talking about a mystical understanding, or mystical knowing, aren't we, in a sense? And the thing about this is, it is both most pious and spiritual and holy, and it is most common and with us everywhere as well. So it's very interesting. I wouldn't want to convey a sense that this is a highly ritualized way of looking at astrology, which treats everything as sacred and is being picking around everything as if in a delicate way. It's not really like that, because it's the very stuff of our life that we are constantly being reminded of by this way that symbolism works and comes true in our life, and little coincidences show us other truths. It's constantly there, and we keep missing it, and then we're reminded of it at certain moments. And once you live life as an astrologer, where you're paying attention to the planets, you will catch yourself out or catch yourself and be brought back to this sort of moment. But so I don't want to give it, aggrandize it. On the other hand, it is an extraordinary thing that there is this other reality at work. What it points to, Dan, and I think most people will recognize the metaphysical position that is implied here, it's that reality is not quite as it seems, and there is the ordinary sensory reality that we are incarnated into, that is our task to work into. We are here embodied. It's our bodily work to live on the planet and work and do things and be and understand things. We have to do that. And yet under that is a cross current of threads of meaningfulness that we half glimpse. We half glimpse, and we suspect that this is what the mystics must know. They must know this full on, but we might not be able to know that full on. But we have glimpses of it given to us, and we recognise the vessels in our lives. For some people it is music and poetry, very definitely are the vessels that bring this to them. For the astrologer, it's their practical work with symbols, which is a practical, ordinary craft. It's in the world, but that brings to them this sense of this other reality. Now, that becomes quite a practical matter, and I hope this isn't jumping too far ahead. Stop me if it is.
No, let's go ahead.
That it's interesting for a thoughtful astrologer to look at their moments of experience and what the experience is like, what it's like to have that moment of recognition, because it's a definite cognitive mode, and your mind switches over. I'm sure the physiologists, the neuroscientists would be able to measure it in terms of a change in the alpha and beta rhythms and this, that, and changes between the two brain hemispheres. But you know it because you're suddenly gripped by a little piece of symbolism, or you laugh at a piece of symbolism, and you've known it, you know it. You don't just think about it rationally, you know it, and you, in a true sense, enjoy it, you joy with it. Even when it's quite dark symbolism. That's why you get this weird thing that astrologers sort of have an accident of some sort. The first thing they do is time it, and then they're delighted if they see something like Saturn, then they've knocked their knee or something. They think, oh great, look at that Saturn transit also. And it's that peculiar way that they've allowed this other reality to cross thread into our lives. And that leads to, when you know that in an interpretation with a client or for yourself, I've used the phrase a realization. You realize the symbolism. And we do this most of the time with our natal chart. You'll know you're a Leo with strong Jupiter on a trine. You'll know that as a piece of rational information, and you'll chug along with that as the way you are. But sometimes you really know it, and you cut yourself out again, being exactly like that, and knowing that is that in me. Isn't that me? And it's a most curious thing. So I invite astrologers to look more at the moments of interpretation. And it's those moments of interpretation that are the moments of astrology. It's the moment at which a symbol crosses over this threshold of reality, and the second different and subtle reality reveals itself to you, and that has a definite effect on you, on your imagination. And if you don't get that when you start astrology, you won't continue with astrology. I mean, you can't just go ploughing on in a purely rational vein and a mechanical sort of vein doing astrology. It'd be a big waste of time. You must find some other way of being creative. So every astrologer, I feel, who lasts in astrology knows this and discovers it. But that's where, and I hope I'm not making a monologue of this, Dan, our rational theories about astrology are a poor fit for the actual experience of astrology, a poor fit. And that does mean we misdescribe it, and for all our best efforts, we then misteach it, or teach it in a way that hinders the appreciation of this. So that's me in a slightly more critical mode, you see. We have theories that don't match.
Yeah. Sure, and this is, I have a couple rejoinders here. This from your colleague, Angela Voss. This mode of perception will not regard stars and planets as causal agents, but as symbols which reflect back to the human soul its inextricable correspondence with the cosmos, and one's astrological insight will depend on the ability and desire of the individual to tune in. And then we also get, Platonists, from Plato, the cosmos not seen as an object that could be scientifically explained. It was firstly a manifestation of the gods, a vast being, or as Plato put it, a living statue.
Yes.
So,
yes.
And then lastly with this, I was talking about the mayor of Casterbridge, which you were saying your partner Maggie loves, right? I just found out about this.
Yes.
Yes. And the Mayor of Casterbridge is a great work of classic literature, Thomas Hardy. And it's really a terrible story, but kind of, like you said, somewhat hilarious. But the Mayor of Casterbridge, Henchard, he gets drunk at an outdoor fair that takes place in the early 19th century and ends up selling his wife to another man. So it's ridiculous.
Yes.
I mean, if your husband's going to do that, you might take your chance with another guy, but
Yes.
it's terrible. But then at the end, he gets his comeuppance and he ends up losing everything. And this novel is a great exploration of fate, free will, the cosmos. He ends up losing everything and everybody. And Hardy writes, all had gone from him one after another, either by his fault or by his misfortune, and we can say either by his character or by the gods. However, but this is the next line, which I think brings us back to this original image on the cover of the book. In place of them, he had no interest, hobby, or desire. If he could have summoned music to his aid, his existence might even now have been born. For with Henchard, music was of regal power. The merest trumpet or organ tone was enough to move him, and high harmonies transubstantiated him. But hard fate had ordained that he should be unable to call up this divine spirit in his need. So we have a lot of things going on there, the need of music or something to move the soul, but it is his fault. I mean, he's this guy who sold his wife to another man.
Yes.
And he does have misfortune of fate. He doesn't have any hobbies or any interests that touch the soul. So there's this interrelationship between all of these elements, fate, free will, all this stuff. But that, again, that I think we're getting onto what the cover of Moment of Astrology communicates in this, and what you're saying, which is we do have this very corporeal sense of life, we're in these bodies, but that there is this other realm that's unknowable, maybe through science. But yet, in the moment of divination, we're given a brief glimpse into that, and then the stars influence us. It's a falling of the stars, not literally a causal thing, but going back to sort of the original definition of like an influenza or a fall or falling,
Yes.
that we fall
Yes.
for a moment, which, I think the cover beautifully suggests.
There's one of the sonnets of Shakespeare that mentions the stars which in secret influence comment. They comment, and they comment secretly upon what is happening with that. So it is in that sense a mirror of the soul. No, it's marvellous, the analogy and expression you give from Thomas Hardy. That is very beautiful, Dan. And it raises a beautiful dilemma of a question, because we have to take responsibility for trying to honour that music or find that way. And if we don't, then we certainly will, over a lifetime, harden our souls so that we cannot succeed. We cannot have happiness if our souls become hard. As to whether one was fated to become hard, that's such an impossible question to answer. And I certainly don't think an astrologer can dare to think they know that answer from the horoscope. That belongs to another order. One has to hope that every soul has the power to make that movement, and that's what the great religious traditions do teach, that every soul does have that capacity and must be allowed to have that capacity. Must be.
Yes. And to, again, bring it back to the image, but move forward. Okay, so let's go back in time to the oracle at Delphi. Everybody will remember the famous oracle. So you actually talk about in Moment of Astrology under what circumstances and auspices that people went to see the oracle. And it was this combination, kind of what we're touching on about, the oracle who was believed to utter the first hexameters of poetic verse. And then it would be interpreted, but these were matters, sacred matters, but also of what one should do, what would be prudent action to take, not necessarily just rendering a prediction, although certainly that is part of it as well. But could you touch a little bit about what was going on at Delphi. I mean, maybe, that Oracle was probably under some kind of influence, as we know now. But, there's this mixture of poetry, but then very real application in life and maybe how one should move.
Yes, these questions of the problems of oracles were well known to the Greek philosophers, including Plutarch, who's a marvelous philosopher of divination. If anyone is interested in him, he was one of the temple staff actually at Delphi, and he lived in the late period of its decline and was looking back onto what had happened. But Plutarch certainly would understand that there isn't a simple either or of how the oracle works. So it's interesting. I think you hinted at under the influence. I mean, people think that there were vapors that were rising up that were influencing the Pythia, or that they might have been in a semi-epileptic fit, and all sorts of rational reasons are given. But really, those reasons don't cancel things out. Or whatever state they're in, something happens at Delphi whereby people are moved by the god in some way. Now, we can reduce it and reduce it and reduce it, but we cannot understand it unless we have that sense that is true for all ancient peoples, and really in all people except our little bubble of civilization misses the point of this connection with a divine realm of things, where there is some otherness, sacred otherness, that we are bound to be with in some way and work with and participate in. So when they go to the oracles, they're very often practical questions with practical outcomes, but they're always crouched in the form of, how does this square with the divine, i.e. is the God willing? So it's not a requesting a prediction about what the God says will happen. It's putting oneself in alignment with the divine in order to take one's action. That's the function of priestly authority, to do that. That's a very cathartic idea, actually, very, very much the initiative. Human beings do take initiatives, but they put those initiatives also in the hands of the gods. Now, it's a curious participation at work, and it's hardly conceivable to modern Western mind, the mindset in which that's done. So you'll each time get, I mean, it happens often even to good scholars, try to think back to this. They're going to miss what it is like to live that way. Who are the people who know how that might be, more likely to be? Well, there'll be modern poets, artists and diviners will get what that's like to live that way, because we still are actually recreating the same understanding in ourselves by being practitioners of astrology, or by being diviners, and by being symbolists and living in this other soul-enriching state of imagination. So of course we can impute all sorts of things to antiquity. We can't quite get in their skins, of course we can't, but we know it's going to be somewhat on this line that we can re-experience ourselves. There is a connection of humanity all the way through here, but we've lost the way of thinking about these things now. We describe them in a different way now, and we reduce them.
It's interesting. A book that comes to mind is, I think it's called Haroun and Other Sea Stories by Salman Rushdie, of all people. But it was, I think, written for his son. It was almost like a children's book work of literature. But the theme is about what happens if you live in a disenchanted, purely materialistic, rationalist worldview versus if you have a more enchanted worldview. And it's about the son tries to help his father get his voice back or his creativity back. It's a wonderful little book. But so let's, again, stay back in time. But astrology, you talk about Ptolemy. Well, actually, one thing, could you just briefly, you said cathartic, but could you define the word for people, catharchy, and what that is?
Right. There's a whole, anciently, a whole branch of astrology was called catharchy, which was the astrology of initiatives, inception moments, human initiatives, setting out on a journey, which we would now call an inception. And it was also horary interrogations, so that came under what was called catharchy. And the word does have an augural origin. It's actually related to the opening of the ceremony at which a ritual sacrifice is made to the gods, or it's the word applied to the authority, the one who leads the dance, the ritual dance. That leading and initiating of the ritual dance is a katarki, is a beginning. So it has an augural connotation way back to Homer and earlier in the Greek. We're clearly reflecting a very ancient understanding here. So this augural term became ported over into astrology, and it's quite clear, therefore, that the early astrologers were closer to an augural approach to the art than we sometimes imagine, because you see, Greek science also is a tremendous, powerful force in the same period. Greek's understanding of mathematics and the nature of reality is extraordinary, and this more scientific cosmos, it's not like modern science at all, but this view of an ordered cosmos where one could learn through mathematics the movements of the planets and the powers of nature itself, was already the beginning of human beings feeling that they have this tremendous knowledge and command of things. And you get a much more deterministic astrology when you couple Greek science and mathematics together with ancient augury. Even so, the Hellenistic astrologers still live in a universe that's rich with soul and the divine, unlike post-Enlightenment astrologers. Post-Enlightenment astrologers have to struggle to get back to that understanding. It's there, but it's covered over all the time. So in that universe, you see, one could say that you treat omens of astrology are in a similar category to the omens that are given to us by the gods in all forms of omen reading. That's why Origins in Divination points to the fact that actually the craft of astrology itself, I'm asserting, has very strong originating place in augury and the observation of signs. Signs, not in the astrological sense, but in the meaningful omen sense, observation of omens.
Yes, and one more word to throw in there along with katarki is Kairos, which is an opportune moment.
Absolutely.
And then, yes,
as opposed to Chronos. So out of the orders of objective time laid out to us that we can measure with a clock, which is the time of Chronos, there is the actual moment of a decision that you make. The human moment is a moment of Kairos, or should be, out of that. We cannot plan our creativity simply using Chronos. The act of creativity demands this cut across that's purely the unique gift of the soul, or the divine, that's given the soul that power, Kairos. And so that comes together with really a very katarkic understanding of astrology. But what goes together with this, and this is where I get into particular theories and things that I'm interested in, what is essential to understand about that more ancient understanding is its participatory nature. The diviner is participating up to the hilt in the materials. Their whole being is laid out in this act. It's not something that you simply at a distance can manipulate as you might a calculator. It's not like that. How could it be like that? That's why it has a ritual component to it. You're engaged fully in this ritual of seeing this symbol.
Yes, and I feel like horary astrology, and this is for people to understand. This is very much astrology of the moment, the chart of the moment, as opposed to one's natal chart, how the heavens were aligned at birth. But in a horary chart, you always take into account the state of the astrologer. So there can be some times where, okay, as an astrologer, I can't take this chart. The chart, I'm not in a good position to take it. And as I understand it, some other astrologers, even they would say, well, you're not ready to read a chart. Like you have to try other mechanisms to figure out this issue for yourself. So that's a point to be made as far as the intertwining with charts, and even with science, because science at least tries to say, okay, we have to do this double blind, that at least there's an acknowledgement of that in some way. But could we get to Ptolemy? What did Ptolemy give us as a gift, but what did he give us as maybe a lump of coal?
Well, it's it's a double thing here. It's both good and bad at the same time, because had Ptolemy not made his tremendous rationalization of astrology and horoscopic craft, especially natal, had he not done that, it's quite possible that astrology would have withered and simply died out. It's difficult for astrologers to imagine that could happen. But in fact, it would be seen as incredible. There is a change of consciousness happening in that era. By the 2nd century AD, there is a big change occurring. We're coming out of archaic ways of thought into another order of thought that still accepts a divine cosmos. But the real important philosophy here behind Ptolemy is Aristotle, who mustn't just be simplified as if he's in any way a reductionist, because Aristotle does teach of a divine cosmos, but a divine ordered cosmos, and he can give a rational and mathematical expression of that cosmos. So Ptolemy actually really, his philosophy is rooted very strongly in Aristotle, and he brings over an Aristotelian interpretation of the way astrology works on the seeds at conception and then reflected at the moment of birth, to give a rational and physical explanation of the working of astrology. And it matches Aristotelian metaphysics and Aristotle's logic and understanding. And so it's a very powerful vessel, and it's a natural scientific model of astrology, natural scientific, according to Greek natural scientific principles. Now, that's a pretty amazing achievement. You see, Ptolemy is also a tremendous astronomer and geographer. He's a very powerful figure. So the authority of him then dealing with horoscopy as a valid form of interpreting influences working on us from birth onwards carries all the authority of Aristotle with it and of Greek science with it, and it holds the field. And what then happens is more supernatural, magical, or religious understandings of astrology get pushed back into the background and get subsumed, and various practices of astrology that appear more obviously divinatory and oracular, such as horary astrology, they too they tend to slip in status, and Ptolemy doesn't really like them, that's quite clear, because he's promoting a natural scientific model. But you see, so in one sense, the whole classical tradition of astrology does flow from that rationalization made by Ptolemy, very largely. And certainly medieval astrology depends on the authority of Ptolemy. So in that sense, I'm a critic of the whole classical tradition. It's a terrible state to be in, of course, but there are other critics of that tradition. But in criticizing it, I'm also acknowledging that had he not done that, astrology wouldn't have had a successful form to go into medieval science and survive in medieval science and survive through to the modern age. And therefore one sees that Ptolemy offers a vessel which enables astrology to work and continue, and is very successful. It's successful until the dispelling of the Ptolemaic cosmos and the Aristotelian underpinning of it that happened from figures like Galileo onwards, and the whole discovery of the Copernicus, Galileo, the discovery of the nature of the cosmos undermines that beautiful natural scientific construction of Aristotle and Ptolemy, and then where it smashes it really. And then astrologers who've relied on that for their scientific authority are left bereft. Once we come past the Enlightenment, there's no physical basis physical, scientific and mathematical basis they can rest their astrology on. So do you see, it's a marvelous, put positively, what Aristotle and Ptolemy achieve is a marvelous combining of a divine cosmos, orderly, highly ordered and scientific in terms of spiritual science or medieval science.
Right. And would you say also, on a more simplistic note, Ptolemy gives us this conception of the self as reflected in the birth chart. So it's something we can both look to, not necessarily as an objective document. So in other words, you have your moment of birth and that can be objectively rendered in some sort of interpretation, but that we have that conceptual framework. And then in a moment of astrology, almost like reading a book or playing a piece of music. It becomes alive.
Yes, I think you're right. Ptolemy and Aristotle, for the classical tradition, they give the credibility and rational basis for you doing this thing. And then when you do this thing, it's up to you for this creative understanding to burst through. Because if I were to say to you, or say to a Greek intellectual or Roman intellectual, that the whole thing is simply omen reading, when I do, so that the horoscope at birth is a set of omens that I regard as occurring at birth, that's going to be, even at that period, it's going to sound a bit crazy. Whereas if you say this is part of a whole pattern of the ordered movement of the heavens and the influences over the whole planetary cycles that beam down upon us through the influence of the planets, and that's a perfectly reasonable explanation. It still means that you are then actually reading the horoscope in this more ancient way, and then grasping the true significance as you realize it in the way that we've been talking about. But you've now been permitted to do that by this scientific, reasonable structure. And the proof of that is, of what I just suggested there, sort of proof, is that model can survive religious attack, because Christianity itself, under the Thomists, with Aquinas and the late medieval Christians, accepted that there's a perfect role for this influence from the heavens on the physical body at that bodily level. The one sin of the astrologer will be if they declare that their astrology allows them to dictate the nature of the movement of the soul, because that means that the soul, you see, that's saying that the soul is bound by the stars. Well, that produces an immediate heresy. But if you say that we are bodily influenced in our natures, and even in our natures, by the stars, that's all part of medieval science. And so you can see the gift that Ptolemy achieved for astrology. So who is to say that he shouldn't have done that? You see, that's what's been given to us. But that's not going to carry us through now. That doesn't work, because that system, that old cosmos, has gone. Now that means we're stuck on something. We're stuck. We have to move.
It's interesting, because it's like I'm Janus. It's there's two heads, and then that's a gateway. But there's you have the Ptolemaic conception, which is the moment of birth, moving towards more of a natural science. But then the old, more divinatory reading. But then you can have both. You can have like a horary chart, and then you can still see how your natal chart fits into that. So there doesn't necessarily have. But you have to accept that the brain kind of wants to function in a binary, and it's going to be this back and forth dialectic. And
exactly. And that's quite a difficult pitch to immediately argue the case for, isn't it? I'm sure you see one has to have this double conception, really. Yes, because you have to be able to have rational explanation for what you're doing. You constantly theorize, we have to justify it, and you have authorities that help you justify it, and then the actual living creativity of it bursts through in the middle of that. But this due diligence of the craft then does come from observing. There does have to be a consistent, communicable, rational form given to it. You have to have rules that you teach people to do the astrology by. They have to learn it. The meanings are given and handed down. This is all perfectly rational, but then you take off. The astrologer at that point takes off, and the real work is done.
Yes, and all right, we're going to go forward in time, although we're not talking about the philosophy of time here, but let's go with linear time for a minute. There have been a lot of attacks against astrology, but it's always good you have to look to challenge oneself. What are the skeptical arguments? So a lot of people, as you touched a little bit on the religious attacks, and we could go more into that, but really Moment of Astrology focuses on humanists, Renaissance humanists, specifically Pico della Mirandola, and also perhaps more a famous figure, Marsilio Ficino, who we've already touched on, but who was one of the progenitors of the Renaissance. So why were they mad at astrologers? What were they objecting to?
Right. I'm going to have to go back to an earlier attack in order to answer you that, and back to
Okay.
the basis of the religious attacks.
Okay.
You see, I believe that for those of us who want to theorize about astrology or teach about it and be historians of it, philosophers of it, and I'm in that category really, we have to take on board that what our opponents say and why it is they say it. So one of the greatest attacks on astrology is that of St. Augustine, because he had a tradition that comes off Cicero, who's equally skeptical, but he also has a double attack because his attack is both scientific. He knows the scientific problems of astrology, problems of twins and stuff like that, and he also knows the theological and religious arguments about astrology. In particular, Augustine would say that, I'm paraphrasing vastly to try and simplify it before I come to the Renaissance and Ficino. Augustine would say that you astrologers are ignorant of the nature of the psychic power that enters into you at the moment that you do have the moment of astrology. He's perfectly aware of what I've talked about, that moments of realization. Augustine is perfectly aware of that. He says, don't you realize you're not clear, you're muddled in your thinking, because there are many, many influences coming in psychically to you. Some of them are not of pure intention. How do you know what's a good spirit as opposed to a bad spirit that's entering you at that point? And he is talking that spirit daimonic way. And in fairness to Augustine, you see, at that period in evolution of religious thought, a great many ordinary people would think that plagues and disasters and things are sent by God through the diamonds to punish us. And he sends bad diamonds and illnesses down upon us as a punishment. Now, we don't want to think that way these days, but you can see why, for the early Christians, the idea that the heavens are determining how you decide your relationship with the divine, God, that's dreadful. And he sees, Augustine will say, that that's how really a satanic influence will work in you, because it will pervert your soul until your soul believes that it's governed by the stellar motions. And that's the first move to direct your soul away from looking at God. So you can see the theology of it. But the importance of that attack isn't that, I mean, I don't agree with Augustine for lots of profound reasons, learned though he is. But what's important is astrologers don't know usually how to answer that. They don't even think. A lot of ordinary astrologers fall back on a natural scientific Aristotelian Ptolemaic explanation, say, oh, no, we're not in any way dealing with supernatural forces, without accepting that we are in fact dealing with the forces that produce grace and revelation in life and that is spiritual, and without being able to develop a spiritual argument in defense. The arguments used in defense of astrology are natural scientific ones. The great attacks on astrology come from a spiritual, a declaration of the spiritual nature of astrology, which is being read by Augustine as largely leading to ill effects, not good effects, because bad spirits get in. Now, whether or not one agrees with Augustine, one should take on board that statement, because we are dealing with an intermediate realm of the psycho-spiritual, where you can't demarcate where your consciousness ends and some inspiration from somewhere is coming in, and how you therefore live your life and the attitude you have to these divine other beings is crucial. And if you're just slack or selfish or lazy, you're going to get infected by this material. Now, that's like people who do like low magic and think they can just easily do low magic to get results. And you'll know a lot of that in New Orleans, won't you? This sort of
that's what I was just going to say. So, right. So, I don't want to move too quickly, but
I want to go to Ficino, you see.
Yes. Well, I'm going to talk about New Orleans a little bit and what goes on here, but just briefly, and we've talked about this, but when we're talking about Pico della Mirandola, astrologers, you talk about a story, and it's hard to know if it's true or not, but the lesson is still the same. They actually predicted his death, and that puts us in a very difficult, terrible ethical position with astrology. And probably one where, when you say in the book, when you put this to astrologers, it's nobody wants to stay there predicting death, because if there is a kind of electional ability to try to change the outcome. Well, it's if somebody's burning in a house, you're going to send a fire engine down there. So why would you? I mean, it's a pretty basic point. But yes, I have. So I live in New Orleans. I actually live. It's the Crescent City, and I live across from the French Quarter. And for people who don't know, the French Quarter, it's an extraordinary slice of the moon as expressed through land. And I don't know if there's anywhere like it in the world where you have people just sitting out up and down the street on Jackson Square doing tarot readings. There's probably every form of religion and spirituality represented here in this city. But I live across the river in what used to be a Masonic temple, and I work here. And it's a very different experience, and I feel a little bit protected from some of those energies where I hear a lot of the people over in the French Quarter predicting death. And I warn people who come here, because oftentimes they come to New Orleans almost on a spiritual pilgrimage. They go see several psychics, then they come to see me. And sometimes I have to do cleanup work because these horrific things people tell them, deterministic predictions that will come to pass. And this is essentially what, from what you were saying before, divorcing astrology from some sort of spiritual orientation. But what Pico and Ficino were really objecting to. But talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Okay, yes. So Ficino is the teacher, really, of Pico. So I think there's a 29-year difference between them. I think it's something like that, the Saturn return. But and in fact, Ficino calls Pico a sublime son of Saturn. Now these two really form a train of Neoplatonic thinking that underlies the Platonic Academy in Florence. Ficino was funded by the Medicis to begin a tremendous program of translation of the Hermetic corpus and Plato and Iamblichus, major Greek texts which had only ever existed in the Greek. And many people in Europe didn't even know of the existence of these texts, but they came over from Byzantium and with the Arabs, these texts. And Ficino began this tremendous program of translation. So that's the first thing. He is then, in any case, very involved in magical musical therapy. You see, the idea of the harmony of the spheres and the actual music that heals using planetary the planets as part of a healing. So we don't know a lot about that, but Angela Voss is my colleague, is really a world expert on that and has reconstructed some of the ritual and the music that Ficino and the Platonic Academy has practiced. So they saw themselves as going back behind the medieval period to much earlier origins of Christianity and then back into the ancient world and restoring an ancient wisdom that is expressed most perfectly for them in the Hermetic canon, the Hermetic writings, Hermes Trismegistus. That takes us into another whole podcast. But that type of understanding, the Hermetic Neoplatonic understandings, are much more magical and imaginal than are the Aristotelian and Ptolemaic and natural scientific approaches, you see. So the Middle Ages does become very governed by Aristotelian thought, and Plato, who was much less known at that time, is recovered by the Platonic Academy. So you have Ficino doing this work, and they immediately see the spiritual and sacred depth of astrology, and they find themselves in contention with astrologers who are naive and have little understanding of their own history for a start, who then adopt the power of as if they're talking like great oracles of the sacred of the past, and yet backed by the science of Aristotle and the stars. So they've done an odd combination that they can say to somebody, my craft isn't simply like a mere superstitious fortune teller. It is science, and it is has Aristotle behind it, and I can make determinations of the length of your life, and I can tell you about life and death and such things. And Ficino and Pico were appalled at the deterministic nature of a lot of the astrology of their time. And they call the astrologers petty ogres who fate their clients with their predictions. And so they're claiming the power of oracles and science at the same time. And it's because they don't have a good grasp, really, philosophically or spiritually, of what they're doing. So that's a major criticism of the way the classical tradition had fallen. I will say fallen, really. It isn't. I mustn't blame Ptolemy and Aristotle for this. It gets misunderstood very fundamentally. There are other threads here that go back to Stoicism and other very interesting threads, but basically it's that attack on determinism and reductionism that they're making. And really they're coming at it as a position as practicing magicians, high magicians, but with a sense of the spiritual and sacred and ritual truth of everything. And they're then coming at astrology with that understanding. At the same time, Ficino is a well-practiced astrologer. He's a perfectly competent craft astrologer. So he does he understands the practice of astrology and uses it, but it's always to this higher purpose. Now, Pico is more scorching, and
I have Moment of Astrology right in front of me. This is pretty much the first page, and you have a quote from things are really heated today, but things were really.
Astrology.
Yeah, I mean, so take for example, it was. I have a musical background, so Bach would get in a duel in the middle of a street with a sword, or you think of shootouts. But this is what Pico was writing to give an idea of the sort of invective that people were engaging in. The writings of astrologers intrude everywhere. They corrupt philosophy, adulterate medicine, weaken religion, strengthen idolatry, destroy prudence, pollute customs, blight the heavens, and make men anxious, unquiet, and unfortunate in all things. So these weren't it wasn't let's get together and have a spirited conversation. I mean, they were this literally was life and death. I mean, the astrologers predicting death, and then back to your point about you must what the magicians were saying. You have to understand maybe the psychic power that you're levying.
Any prediction carries psychic force,
right?
Spiritual consequence, and that is so absolutely summarized in the fact that Pico, then, who wrote against the astrologers, was then attacked by 3 astrologers of Florence, and there is historical record. This is so. 3 astrologers of Florence predicted his death for him before the age of 33. He was still a young man, you see. At the time, he was about 29, 30 at the time he was coming out with this stuff. And he then died before his 33rd birthday, and the astrologers claim this as the proof, despite his great intellect. They acknowledged that he was an absolutely inspiring intellectual. The stars spoke against him more truly by his death than against all his writings against the astrologers. And to me, they have so misunderstood what it means to make a prediction of death against somebody because they're an intellectual or other enemy of you. This is ethically the pits, isn't it? This is not to understand the sacred nature of what you're doing. And you can then understand, I know it's a funny back to front argument, you can understand why someone like Pico would be so angry with astrologers in the first place, that they have that mindset that's going to then do that to him. And that story got taken up in the annals of astrology as a famous victory for astrology.
Oh dear.
Astrology, it can be much questioned on all sorts of dimensions, but it's mostly questionable at that deep ethical level. You can see why Augustine is in a sense justified in some of his original attacks if this is the way astrologers carry on. So I'm interested in the great moments of crisis in astrology, like later on the humanist attack on astrology in our era, because what it is they illuminate about our own self-understanding as astrologers. Do you see? And I tend to think we're very weak in this ethical, philosophical, spiritual way of talking about astrology. We are rather weak, and I mean that with no disrespect to the many who've attempted this, but we still flounder around, I'm afraid, and can't deal with these problems half the time.
I'm actually interested aesthetically about humanism. So when you're talking about Ficino or Pico, we're talking about true Renaissance men. So those are the humanists, and they're attacking astrology in their time. As we're saying, they're marshaling good arguments that we should consider. But then we fast forward to the 70s and the modern humanism of the 70s. I'm interested aesthetically because I really spend a lot of time reading literature, poetry. I do some singing. I sing excerpts from Handel's Messiah in church, this kind of stuff. It's interesting because if I'm going to be attacked, I want to be attacked by Ficino, but the aesthetics of modern humanists, they don't strike me as very learned in the arts of poetry or literature or the humanities. I mean, you don't see modern humanists it's very because aesthetic means perception. It's not very pleasing to me. You could have the worst, the toughest arguments and one has to deal with them. But do you ever think about this? Modern humanism is not really being that aesthetically pleasing.
Yes, and I haven't put it quite in that way. That's a very interesting way of putting it. That it's not even aesthetically pleasing. It doesn't attract. It doesn't attract the soul. It's geared at rational arguments that is supposed to win the day, without realizing that the soul needs to be nourished at the same time. There is a difference between the two humanisms are vastly different, and we can ask, well, what is it? Why on earth are they named the same?
Yes.
You can call I would use I know it's a clumsy way of phrasing, but the humanism of Ficino and Pico is magical religious humanism, whereas the humanism of our modern era is rational scientific humanism, and they have ultimately two quite different sources of authority. For the magical religious humanists, they do exalt. Exalt the nature of human mind to be, in a sense, equal participant with the divine, and they see the wonder of human mind as transcending up to the highest point, and they feel that aspects, I suppose their criticism of a lot of aspects of medieval thought is that it was pious, but it crushed that spirit and didn't give man and human being that transcendence. There is something transcendental about the attitude to human being with the Renaissance humanists. Now that is why you see the most famous text of Pico's is Oration on the Dignity of Man. Oration on the Dignity of Man. So that it would raise man to be with Christ, you see. It wouldn't in any way deny or attack the spiritual, but it would want to see the true raising of us. Now, there are lots of arguments that the cultural historians can make that I think have a lot of truth to them, that this actually is a brief moment in European history, and it actually sets up the precursor for the scientific enlightenment, because this emphasis on the powers of the human mind lends itself naturally to making that more and more what you're treating as number one priority. Less and less do you rely on the divine or the sacred inspiration behind it, until that's where the divine begins to be shaken by this. So that's a very complex argument to take, but you do see the difference of the two humanisms. The modern rational humanist point of view simply will not tolerate an idea that there's some other divine that is beyond our ordinary perception, which we in some way are cooperating with. They'll just regard that as a fanciful delusion left over from ancient religion. And they'll rely on a rational method, especially scientific method, as the correct mode of thinking about these things. So it's a cognitive limiting modern ethical humanism. But actually, it's probably to be called ethical humanism. They are concerned with the ethic of human being, which is they share that with the magical religious humanists, actually.
And it's interesting because one of the points, correct me if I'm wrong, in Moment of Astrology, it's this privileging of science by both humanists, or not that it has to be mutually exclusive, but let's say humanists and astrologers. It's this tacit acceptance of science as somehow proving a position or proving the position of astrology. And and by the way, there are all sorts of charts in Moment of Astrology that show, okay, here was the inception date of, say, this attack. If people might remember the famous, it was like signed by 173 humanists warning people against astrology. There's the chart of that, and it's not just, this is not just an abstract theoretical text, but there are stories in here, stories about Pico, stories about what was happening and as seen through astrology. So it's a very narrative text in that, narrative astrological text in that way.
It's good, nice. Thank you, Dan, for saying that. Otherwise, it would sound so abstract and tedious, wouldn't it? No, thank you for saying that.
Yeah, and I have a couple other stories that I've read either in Moment of Astrologies or Moment of Astrology, and I'll bring those up. But at what point, because to give people a little bit of a background again about the history of astrology, there was this real feeling. First you said, the type of astrology that is more explicitly divinatory horary astrology, really nobody was doing it. And there was also this feeling that, look, if we just do proper science, if we do double blind, everything's set up well, then that will prove our point. So when were you starting? And then, to be quite frank, a lot of those studies don't go well for astrologers. I mean, this is a huge topic, and we don't really have time to go into all the details. But a lot of those studies really did not go well. There was the famous study, the Manhattan suicide study, where it was basically, could you see a signature of suicide in a natal chart? And it was essentially zero. There were no correlations. Which, interestingly, I had a friend recently, non-astrologer, but he looked at that briefly and he's like, well, that's a wonderful thing to happen because it means suicide is not preordained. And if there's some kind of message from that study, regardless whether it's, a daemon speaking or just chance, that's a great message. Wouldn't we want that to be true, that suicide's not preordained? It seems it's scientifically bad for astrologers, but it's spiritually wonderful to see that. But anyway, so just to get a little bit just back to the history, what was going on about as far as if we just do the science, it'll prove our point, that'll settle everything, we'll show them. And then where were you in all of that at that time?
Well, yes, I've sort of lived through that era of all the scientific wave in astrology. And it took me a long time in my own thinking to get all the bits sorted out. So there was a whole issue of the Goklan data, you see, that had cited astrologers. I always felt that there was something that wouldn't work about those Vernon Clark tests, but as I say in Moment of Astrology, I wondered if that was just my cowardice. I didn't want to be tested. You see, you can't.
Sure.
But what you've said something very important, actually. It is that as your friend said about the suicide study, it is rather remarkable that we can see in those studies that astrology is not a deterministic system. It can't be, because if it were, it would have some statistics would be able to come up to show something of that. Now, if it's not a deterministic system, what is it? Of course, the ultimate skeptic will say it's all just rubbish or delusion. You say, no, it's not a deterministic system, but it has a power of, in the moment, in the Kairos, reflecting truthfully a completely individual constellation of reality at that point. Now, that is remarkable. If true, that's remarkable. You see, it's my whole understanding of omens. Omens have the power to reveal the constellation of the soul as it's located in the world at that moment, and that's uniquely for that soul who sees and knows the omen, because omens are always addressed to somebody who sees them as ominous. So yes, it's I think I mentioned in Moment of Astrology, I've had a couple of cases where I formed a very strong impression that suicide was a strong possibility here in a person I was involved with from the astrology. But I know that's not preordination. It's the signs that are now being generated by the soul of the person themselves give me that sign. And that's an entirely different possibility, isn't it?
Yes. To go back to the Vernon Clark trials, because I think those were interesting insofar as you had written that they provide wildly erratic results. There actually were some positive results, but then maybe having trouble to get replicated. But it was really this participatory nature when you still had double blind, but you had astrologers kind of doing it live with other people. And there's an interesting little video online. It was the astrologer Geoffrey Armstrong and it's the skeptic Michael Shermer. And they did an interesting similar test where it was, again, other people in another room and an astrologer doing it live. And you can find this on YouTube. It's Geoffrey Armstrong, Michael Shermer. But basically...
Is that with a J? Geoffrey with a J?
Yes. Yes.
Geoffrey Armstrong, Michael Shermer. We'll look at that. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because he did yield positive results on the face of it. And then interestingly, they switched up a couple of the charts and the people were like, you know what, that doesn't sound like me. And then they switched the charts back and people were like, oh, yes, that's me. So it's this concept of sort of a live reading, but still with proper double blind, whatever. Although there were some good skeptical arguments brought in as well. There was a astrologer who then became a skeptic and she was there, and then they did a live sort of in-person reading, and it was well, this could be cold reading, but still there's a general idea that, hey, maybe there is really something to this participatory nature of astrology that's really the key to it. So I don't want to jump too quickly into the next thing, but then this gets into destiny being negotiable versus destiny non-negotiable, and that we do in some sense have this machinery of destiny. I mean, the plane flies, we have we have gravity, we have classical physics and all this stuff, but then somehow divination actually disrupts this, especially as you say, when you do it properly, you have your craft and you're open to somewhat of the chance or divine element that is being brought forth through the process of divination. Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about that? Destiny is negotiable versus destiny is non-negotiable.
Well, right.
I know.
Well, I know. Well, back to the Greek scientific achievement, mathematics of the cosmos, that certainly gave people the idea that because the planets are, good heavens, but dogs barking outside.
That's okay.
That's funny. That gave people the idea that because the planets which give omens can be calculated in advance as an ephemeris, therefore one's life is conducted like the ephemeris. One can see, put that way, it's a very naive conception. But that does take hold in astrology over and over again, that gives a certain determining power simply by the objective scientific nature of the planets being there. Right. So that leads to a model of astrology which I call the machine of destiny, with its grinding up. And it's interesting that even Velvet Glove approaches to astrology like humanistic astrology, for which I've got a lot of time, but humanistic astrology doesn't quite get out of that trap because it says that you have trends and potentials. Well, that's still not good enough if you've been with ephemeris precision, clockwork generated trends and potentials. Still doesn't really cut the mustard. There's something much more mysterious at work here. So when we do go back to the augural origins of astrology, we see that the religious attitudes of those cultures have a strong negotiating element with the planets. It's normally collective and with the king, but it will be that the divine isn't just sitting there pushing us around. It is actually in a compact with us and will be working with us or against us if we don't listen to it. But it's not, the participation is the essential element there. And once you have a participatory element, that is why it's odd about destiny, because there are some themes in life where you see the way it seemed destined to happen, but it does still depend on you at the key moment, making a creative move instead of a negative, selfish or egotistical move. It depends on that. And you begin to realize, yes, I did, as if you're helping your destiny along and then participating in it. So the word is negotiable, capable of being negotiated, but for most people in their lives, they set themselves on a certain track. You will know, and I will know, and hearers who are astrologers will know. You can get people and you can see the way they're living their life. The chart seems to run just nice and hunky-dory the way they're living their life, and you can see what's coming because there's something about their life that is so already stamped in them that it shows you right now where it's going. Now, who is predetermining who here? It's actually the person is living in a ultimately concrete way that doesn't give space for true creativity or freedom, and they will therefore hit the inevitable consequences of that attitude. And you're being shown now the signs of that, but it isn't given at birth that they will always have to do this. It could have been a completely other constellation of reality that they came up with when they see an astrologer. So it's a subtle business. I mean, it's difficult for the mind to grasp the idea that participation with a divine order of things is a scope for true freedom. And at that point, you see, you've bridged the gap with Christianity and all the great religions. You haven't dictated that the soul is bound. It's not.
Yes, and I think Thomas Hardy might be able to help us again through the Mayor of Casterbridge. And so it is this acknowledgement that there is this machinery of destiny. There are the stars. You know, I had another astrologer on, Ariel Gutman, and she does a lot of work with what she calls the Venus star point. When the Venus is Cazimi, the sun, that's like, she works with this. It's her, really technique. But she, on the podcast, she was like, look, we're kind of stuck with the way the planets are moving. I mean, we're not changing, at least not now, the way Saturn is moving. But so, in the Mayor of Casterbridge, it's essentially about this machinery, but how do you handle it? So Henchard, the protagonist, obviously he falters, but at the end of the book, we learn that the ingenious machinery contrived by the gods for reducing human possibilities of amelioration to a minimum. But it's basically this theme of, as well, there is this machinery, but all along the way, he never tried to look at the stars and maybe imagine something different. And interestingly, his daughter, and who becomes later his daughter's husband, they're actually much more imaginative. They understand this machinery of the stars, but then about, her name's Elizabeth, Hardy writes, fancies find room in the strongest minds. So again, imagination. So, it's about imagination and having imagination to play with the stars, not necessarily not acknowledging that there is this machinery of the stars, but to play with them. And I can't find the exact quote. It was these guys, we used to, when I lived in Connecticut, I used to show up with them, and they were Buddhists, but they spent a lot of time reading Greek. And they were reading like Marcus Aurelius in Greek. And there was one passage where Marcus Aurelius said, like, appreciate the beauty of the stars, but don't be moved by them. I mean, and he was very much not, I was reading some of the stuff, not into conjurers or not into poetry or being moved by rhetoric. So, very much, what you're talking about, if I may, like sort of this stoicism. And then this, again, coming back to character as destiny. We have our character, it's kind of fixed, our own nature, but what do you do with that? Especially in moments as revealed through divination. Okay, yes. A couple stories I think that could be helpful. People might remember a gentleman named Paul Kurtz. I don't know if you remember this story, but he was one of the big Arctic critics of astrology. And you said you actually met him at one point. And do you remember that meeting?
Yes, I think I mentioned a little anecdote of meeting him by a coffee machine at a conference of the skeptics.
Right.
I pushed up to him rather rudely, I suppose, and said I was an astrologer. And I said, what would he say if I said that astrology is a form of poetics? It's a poetry of the heavens, and that I'm not trying to be scientific. And when I said that, he said, briefly, obviously trying to hold on to his coffee, he said, gee, that would be just fine. Because
so, funny...
gee, that would be just fine. Yes, I mean, the point being, he will treat poetry as in a different order to science, and not a problem, not a challenge to science. So So this comes down to your note. I know you want us to talk about and perhaps end on that the future of astrology and the scientific endeavour. You see, I think we do ourselves a terrible disservice by trying to rely authoritatively on a rational, technical, scientific and empirical approach. It's not that those are wonderful truths and they're important gifts to us, and the Enlightenment's given us these gifts, but they're not the way of understanding these deeper questions of mind and reality. They simply are not. And in fact, it's through poetry, poesis, mythopoesis, that we better approach what the mystery of astrology is. And that, to my mind, must remain the future task of astrology.
You know, it's interesting. I remember when I used to live in Connecticut, and I used to, actually, a very lovely group of people. It was a humanist group, and there was a lady there, and somehow these conversations just get going, and she's like, isn't there any place for mystery and wonderment and beauty? Yeah. And I think that this kind of goes back to my aesthetic point about modern humanism. It's kind of like, all right, take a look in the mirror. Is this, hey, maybe like have these studies, or you're doing science, but you know what? This poem, and there's actually at Yale University, there's I think it's some sort of part of the university that it seeks to bridge science and the humanities. So it seems like and I actually used to talk to the gentleman, actually an ornithologist, who ran this, sort of little institute. And there was a gentleman who gave a lecture there by the name of Hassak Chang, and he really, a theoretical physicist, and he was really very much into the idea of dispensing with scientific monism, or, well, let's say, like, hey, Newton got some things wrong, but we still teach him. You know, or maybe Freud got some things wrong in light of other things, but we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So maybe an excavation of some past things can reinform the present and the future, and hopefully in an enchanting way. Another story that I loved in Moment of Astrology, Herodotus. And this gets into, again, the omens. It was some sort of battle that I think it was between the Greeks and the Persians, and the omens were bad. And do you remember what happened in this story?
Yes, it's that the Spartans then made a move at the same moment that Pausanias, I think it was, leading all of the independent Greeks. He got good omens at that point, as he was taking one further shot at getting good omens, and spontaneously at that moment the Spartans made a break that altered the whole shape of the battle as he got a good omen. And you ask, well, which way round is it working? It's not a causal connection here. It's simply that as the mood of the mind of the Spartans changed and they made their move, that itself already is the lucky move that brings a lucky omen. It all goes together. You can't make a causal train there. And that certainly is that it is open to us to seize our destiny, is what I would say, which they did at that moment. But now we've gone a long time on this, haven't we? Are you sure your listeners are going?
Yes, we're coming. Yes, we're coming to the end, I promise. And it's interesting because I think you write in Moment of Astrology that one of the generals saw a temple of Hera and he got a second wind, and that led to victory. Or so it's these moments to moments. It's each individual moment in space and time. And then also, I've been reading a lot of writers. They're like Philip K. Dick or Ursula Le Guin, science fiction writers, although still great. They're just really great literature, great science fiction. And they seem to be like, okay, let's just, we don't, at some point we might, like I think even Thomas Pynchon in Gravity's Rainbow, he talks about, oh yeah, that person's still stuck on causation. Like it's this idea, it's like causation, like linear thinking and linear reactions, it's not the only thing going on. And to get back to your point about seizing your destiny, one of my favorite, there was an episode of The Twilight Zone. I don't know, do you remember The Twilight Zone?
I do, okay. Yes.
It's a great episode called Nick of Time, and it's, of all people, William Shatner, and it's a newlywed couple, and they break down in, a small town. I guess they're on their way to New York or something, and they're in Ohio.
I know
And
the episode you're
oh, do
talking
you know
about.
this
Oh,
episode?
yes, the nick of
Right.
time where there's this little
Yes.
predictive machine on the table.
Yes, and basically it comes like they're addicted. He's like, "Will I get the job?" And then he calls up and yes, and then it's like they keep going with it, and then finally his fiance is like, "We're done with this. You can what you're saying, seizing destiny. Are we going to just sit here chained to this napkin holder, or are we going to,
Yes.
are we going to like move on with things? I mean, that's because it's like, okay, what does the chart say? Well, how much are you spending time looking at charts or else just living life?
That's right.
Yeah. So another thing too, you talked a little bit about psychological astrology, and this is very interesting again in the context of one's natal chart, with a more divinatory or momentary conception of astrology, but that somebody can come into, and this gets into classical psychoanalytic thinking, but transference as a metaphor. So you can have the analyst and then the analysand, like the client and the patient, and the patient projects things onto the analyst, and sometimes you can actually see that in the chart. So that astrology is potentially a really fruitful ground to bring into the psychological arts. And
Yes,
it's
it
very
is.
interesting. I have one quickly. It's funny, and I'm not a therapist. I don't claim that at all. Not a medical professional or anything. But I get a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists coming to me because they complain in their field a lot of the time. It's so rationally bound that there's no element for creativity and heart in it. So I wonder if you had any brief thoughts on that, like one's own character, but then there's a chart that emerges, and that the transference, and this is for maybe therapists to think about, or even just anybody that is counseling somebody, that it can be shown in the chart.
Yes, well, we've raised a variety of issues there, Dan. There are several levels of that. I do think we can learn a lot from the psychotherapists and psychoanalysts about what happens in these exchanges in the transference. We need to learn about that. And I agree that transference phenomena will then be mirrored in the constellation of the horoscope. You do have to watch that we're talking about two different craft traditions here, you see, and melding them is quite a trick. Do you know what I mean? You're talking.
Yes.
You have the whole tradition of practice, and it's ritual and craft of psychoanalysis, and you have the quite different sort of tradition of astrology,
Right.
and one mustn't reduce one to the other. But
Sure.
I do think they can learn from each other. But
Right.
yes, so I mean, I like the type of work in astrology that is to some degree ongoing, where you're talking with a client, and it raises all the issues of omens and symbolism, and it be extended over a number of sessions. I think that's very fruitful and can be very fruitful work, and that's not dissimilar to psychotherapy treatment. But that's another whole podcast, Dan. That really
Sure.
is another whole
Sure. I think that.
podcast.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think the basic point being the chart can reveal something in the context of a psychological session or some sort of counseling session.
That's right. That's right.
So, and this is actually a general point anyways, that there are all sorts of people of all kinds of disciplines, and what you were going on just in the beginning, hey, there can be a basic sun sign. And, take, for example, I was in a reading group, we were discussing Mayor of Casterbridge, and the gentleman said, well, I related to Henchard because at some point he fights with the bulls, and it's my own nature, and I've had some missteps in my life, and I'm a Taurus. So what are you supposed to do? That there's something really live there that's very amazing, and it can be brought into literature. So there are all these different disciplines that can really learn from astrology and vice versa. And it actually, he was a Catholic gentleman, so he had some reservations, but I was able to field the conversation and say, well, hey, so there's so much opportunity. And we can really make a turn. And remember, turns are the whole basis of astrology. You think of the tropical zodiac, tropicos or tropos, the turning of those solstice points. So we have to make these turns. I mean, we can.
We astrologers need to think better and more purely about what it is we're doing, because we're muddled in our theories. That's one of the themes. Remember, I was always coming back to. We have an extraordinary gift, a treasure that we've been given, and we sometimes slightly mess it up with our theorizing, our rationalizing of it.
Right. And, it's interesting too, as far as the future of astrology. It's not like people aren't interested in astrology. It's like, you have all the humanists really going after astrology. You have tons of people, there's an interest, and even skeptics, sort of, they're closet astrologers. There's a lady, her name is Sally Quinn. She wrote a book called Finding Magic, and her husband was the late Ben Bradley, who was the publisher of the Washington Post.
Right.
And for years and years, she had used astrology. And she came from the South, like, again, this area, New Orleans. I think she had spent time here. And because she had a blog called On Faith, and she interviewed at one point Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. And Richard Dawkins apparently has this superstition that he jumps over a crack. Well, that's not very rationalist now, is it? Like, if you should be like, well, is this does this superstition mean anything? Let's test it. Or apparently Christopher Hitchens, according to Sally Quinn, he read his horoscope a lot, almost like daily. So this is not exactly being a proper skeptic, in my opinion. But we have all these polls, like, people are massively interested in astrology. I mean, it's not like there's not the interest out there. I mean, we're talking, like, what is it, 90% of people know their sun sign? I mean, it's like, and then even still, like, how many people at least glance at their horoscope? I write horoscopes it's a magazine called Ambush Magazine here in the Gulf South. And I always I put some of these little paragraphs in there about, hey, take this sort of divinatory of the moment approach to this and see what happens as a moment of reflection. And then that puts the horoscope, I think, in a more, we've used the word grace, but having the grace to, hopefully I can impart some sort of message and it can be interpreted. So there's a participatory nature with a sun sign horoscope, as opposed to just, here's the horoscope, right? And then it's, so one last thing, and then we can close. One of the things we're using these arguments against astrology and accepting them in a large part, although rejecting some of the skeptical arguments, but where does that move us if these things are true? If a lot of these arguments are true, where does that put us? And that moves us somewhere. But that's not to dispense with science of astrology, as you were saying, the Gokulans. I mean, there was something there, it's still debated, but there still is a place for science in astrology. I mean, hell, if we know where Mars is going to be. I mean, we, like, visually in the sky, that's something. Or we know, I mean, there is part of it that is science, but it's not to totally dispense with that stuff. But I think you talk about there needs to be kind of like a wall of separation. At least, okay, do your craft, do astrology. If somebody comes to a book group and she's an Aries and she's been using the moon phases for 20 years, don't say, well, actually, you really should have been doing it this way all along.
Yeah,
but that there still is
right.
the place for, what, I'm seeing a lot of correlations between this. Can it be replicated? We really might look into this. But that these things can really coexist and march on together like the two heads of Janus, and maybe there's a gateway.
Yes, we don't need to have a battle between the two. They need to know their different concerns.
Right.
That needs a more philosophical discrimination by the astrologers of what they're doing. Mm-hmm. So I want to bring philosophy in a true sense into the equation, because then the astrologers wouldn't make mistakes of pitching themselves onto a materialistic model, which they then call science. But science is much broader than that. But that's another whole enormous theme. Because
Right, and the purpose of this podcast is really to give people a feel for these arguments and really a feel for the beauty of astrology and the humanities at large and language.
Yes,
that we've
absolutely.
woven. We have different words, and the words are a thread, and they take us to a different place, and the symbols take us to a different place, a very imaginative place. And let's face it, fragmentation actually can be a gift, because fragmentation in a way brings us to chance and grace, because if it's the throw of cards or tarot cards or throw of I Ching sticks, there is a random chance element to that, and that we can, although some would say that it's, divine intervention, but it still brings us to a glimpse into the divine, whatever that is.
That's right.
And it's a great move.
Good note to end on, the idea of the moment of grace.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, and to have the grace to accept this stuff. All right, thank you so much, Geoffrey. This means
All
the
right,
world
Dan.
to me.
Thank you very much.
And did you? Okay, so Astro Divination is the .com is the website, and also Company of Astrologers.
That's
Any
right.
last words? Any last words, Geoffrey?
No, that's fine. Good luck to everybody doing astrology and keeping
Yeah.
live symbolism. You're doing wonderful work.
Oh, thank you so much. And and also for you moving, that I think we were talking about this, but that the speech you gave on Lily, there's like I was saying, there's a nodal return to that. So this is a recapitulation of some of these themes, and it'll be different this time around.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much. Well, this
Goodbye.
is Dan Beck signing off. Oh, sorry. Thanks, Geoffrey. Bye. This is Dan Beck signing off from the Star Love Podcast. And remember, if you love the stars, they'll love you back. On the next episode of the Star Love Podcast, we welcome astrologer and artist Anne Beversdorf. We discuss Anne's multifaceted career, her unique take on Pluto, and her talent as an artist working with fibers. Thank you for listening, and please rate us on Apple Podcasts. If you're interested in sponsoring a future podcast, email Inner Makeup Business Manager James Filtz at james@innermakeup.net. To support the production of the Star Love Podcast, go to the Leave a Tip, Make a Wish section at innermakeup.net to leave your donation.